September 28th, 2000. It's a Thursday evening in Georgetown, Indiana, and a man named David Camm is heading to the Georgetown Community Church for his regular pickup basketball game. His wife Kim and their two kids, 7-year-old Brad and 5-year-old Jill, are on their way home from swim practice. It's a normal night, just another Thursday, until David pulls into his driveway at 9:26 p.m. The garage door is open. The light inside their Ford Bronco is on, and as he gets closer, he sees something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. His wife, Kim, is lying on the garage floor. Inside the Bronco, his daughter Jill is still buckled in her seatbelt. His son Brad is in the back cargo area. All three of them have been shot to death. David, a former Indiana State Trooper with medical training, immediately tries to perform CPR on Brad. He's moving his son's body, touching him, desperate to bring him back. But it's too late. They're all gone. 3 days later, David Camm is arrested for murdering his entire family. Now, this might sound like just another case where a husband kills his wife and kids. But here's the thing. David Camm didn't do it. And what happened to him over the next 13 years is one of the most disturbing examples of how badly our justice system can fail when investigators decide they've got their guy and refuse to look anywhere else. So, let's talk about it. The night of the murders, David calls 911. He's covered in blood, which makes sense because he'd been trying to save Brad. The timeline checks out too. Kim and the kids left swim practice around 7 p.m., the exact same time David arrived at the church gym. And here's the really important part. There were 11 witnesses who saw David playing basketball when his family was being killed. 11 people, not one or two, 11. But investigators have a problem with David's story. Actually, they have 8 problems. 8 tiny drops of blood on his t-shirt. A crime scene photographer named Robert Stites looks at David's shirt and says these 8 little stains are high-velocity impact spatter. That's the microscopic blood spray that happens when someone gets shot at close range. The kind of blood that would only end up on your shirt if you were standing there holding the gun when it went off. But here's what you need to know about Robert Stites. He's not a bloodstain expert. He's a photographer. 0 formal training in bloodstain analysis. He was sent to the crime scene by a guy named Rodney Englert, who prosecutors hired as their bloodstain expert. Englert couldn't make it to the scene himself, so he just sent his photographer instead. Based on what Stites says and Englert's backing, David Camm gets arrested 3 days after finding his family murdered. 3 days. No other suspects, no other leads. Case closed. The prosecution builds their theory. They say David was having affairs, his marriage was falling apart, and he wanted out. So he left the basketball game, drove home, shot his family, and came back to the church. The church is only about 4 miles from his house, so yeah, technically it's possible. Except all 11 people at that basketball game say David never left, not even once. The prosecutors obviously didn't care. They had their bloodstain evidence, they had their motive, and they had their guy. David's first trial happened in 2002. Rodney Englert takes the stand and swears that those 8 tiny stains are absolutely high-velocity impact spatter from a gunshot. No other explanation was possible. The jury believes him. David Camm was convicted of murdering his wife and 2 children and sentenced to 195 years in prison. But then some of the top bloodstain experts in the entire country look at David's shirt. Experts like Herb McDonnell, who literally invented the field of bloodstain pattern analysis. He wrote the actual book on it back in 1971. McDonnell and several other experts examine the evidence and say those 8 stains aren't impact spatter at all, they're transfer stains. The kind you get when fabric touches something that already has blood on it. Like when a father desperately tries to save his dying son, and his shirt brushes against the boy's bloody hair. And it gets so much worse. In 2003, Herb McDonnell and other bloodstain experts filed an ethics complaint against Rodney Englert with the American Academy of Forensic Science. They accuse him of lying about his education, training, and experience. McDonnell calls Englert a forensic whore, a liar for hire, and the bin Laden of bloodstains. Englert sues them for slander, but the damage is done. And this is the part that should really scare you. Englert had done this exact same thing before. He helped convict another innocent person named Julie Rhea using the same questionable bloodstain analysis. Julie was later freed when they discovered a serial killer named Tommy Lynn Sells had actually murdered her son. So basically the same pattern, same junk science, and same expert witness. David's conviction eventually gets overturned on appeal, but instead of walking free, he's about to face something even worse. February 2005. Almost 5 years after the murders, investigators finally decide to test a piece of evidence they'd been ignoring this whole time, a sweatshirt found at the crime scene. This sweatshirt had been purchased from the Indiana Department of Corrections commissary. Inside the collar, someone had written the word backbone in black ink. When forensic scientists swab the collar, they find a full male DNA profile, and it doesn't match David Camm. They run it through CODIS, the criminal DNA database, and they get a hit. The DNA belongs to a man named Charles Boney. His prison nickname? Backbone. Charles Boney was released from prison just a few months before the Camm family was murdered. He was known as the Shoe Bandit because he'd spent nearly a decade locked up for holding women at gunpoint while he stole their shoes. Yeah, this man had a foot fetish and was willing to terrorize people to satisfy it. But wait, because it gets even more damning. Investigators find Boney's palm print on the outside passenger door of Kim Camm's Ford Bronco. His left palm print right where someone would brace themselves if they were leaning into the vehicle. Like if they were kneeling on the floorboard, reaching their right hand across to shoot 2 children sitting in the back seat. And there's more. Kim Camm's DNA, her saliva, is found on the sleeve of Boney's sweatshirt. This fits perfectly with Boney putting his arm around her neck during a struggle, his sleeve touching her mouth. The evidence is overwhelming. Kim had been forced to remove her shoes and pants during the attack, which matches exactly with Boney's criminal history. Here's a violent predator with a foot fetish who got out of prison weeks before the murders. His DNA is at the scene, his palm print is on the car, his sweatshirt is left behind with the victim's DNA on it. You'd think this is where the story ends. David gets released, Boney gets charged, and justice is served. But that's not what happens. The prosecutors had spent years telling everyone David Camm was a family killer. They'd destroyed his reputation in the media. They'd convinced the entire community he was a monster. They can't just admit they were wrong. No way. So instead, they come up with a new theory. David and Boney must have been working together. The funny thing is, when police first interview Boney, he denies knowing David Camm. The investigators actually suggest to him that maybe he met David while playing basketball. Boney says no, never played basketball with him, never even met him. He also claims he donated all his clothes to the Salvation Army when he got out of prison, which turns out to be a complete lie. But when police find Boney's palm print on the Bronco, he suddenly changes his story. The prosecutors give him 2 options: become a witness against David Camm, or face the death penalty as the sole murderer. So Boney chooses to talk. His new story is that he met David at a basketball game at a community park. David asked to buy a gun. Boney sold him one, wrapped in his sweatshirt. According to Boney, David must have used that gun to kill his family. But the thing is, this story makes absolutely no sense. If Boney just sold David a gun and left, how did his palm print get on the Bronco at the murder scene? How did Kim Camm's DNA end up on his sweatshirt sleeve? Why would David leave Boney's sweatshirt at the scene, basically creating evidence pointing to another person? Even the prosecutors admit that Boney's credibility is doubtful, but they use his testimony anyway. In 2006, David faced his second trial. This time, both he and Boney are charged as co-conspirators. The prosecution argues that David hired Boney to kill his family, or they worked together somehow, despite 0 evidence connecting David to Boney. Despite 11 witnesses placing David at the church during the murders, despite Boney's completely ridiculous story, the jury convicts David again, and this time he gets sentenced to life in prison. David's defense team appeals based on prejudicial evidence. The conviction gets overturned, hence a 3rd trial. By 2013, a private investigator named Bill Clutter had gotten involved. Clutter started a project called Investigating Innocence, and David's case is their first one. Clutter does something brilliant. He creates an animated crime scene reconstruction showing exactly how the murders happened. The reconstruction demonstrates how Charles Boney, acting completely alone, placed his left hand on the outside of the Bronco's passenger door to brace himself, how he knelt down and reached his right hand across to shoot Brad and Jill, how he attacked Kim in the garage, forcing her to remove her shoes and pants before killing her. Every single piece of crime scene evidence matches Boney acting alone. Nothing requires David's involvement. Students from the University of Indiana help review the case with fresh eyes. More experts examine the blood on David's shirt and confirm it's a transfer stain, not impact spatter. New touch DNA testing provides even more evidence connecting Boney to the crime scene. The defense also points out something crucial. There is absolutely zero evidence that David and Boney knew each other before the murders. There were no phone records, no witnesses, no financial transactions, no connection whatsoever. Boney's story kept changing every single time he got caught in a lie. He was a career criminal trying to avoid the death penalty by telling prosecutors what they wanted to hear. On October 24th, 2013, after 13 years in prison, after 3 trials, after having his name dragged through the mud for over a decade, David Camm walks out of that Lebanon, Indiana courthouse a free man. The jury finds him not guilty. 13 years of his life, gone. David lost 13 years because investigators decided on day 1 he was guilty and refused to consider anything else. They ignored the sweatshirt with backbone written on it. They ignored the lack of gunshot residue on David's hands. They ignored 11 alibis. They built their entire case on junk science from a discredited expert. And then when the real killer's DNA showed up, they just added him to the story instead of admitting they were wrong. Charles Boney is currently serving a 225-year sentence for the murders. He's never admitted to acting alone. He still clings to his story about selling David a gun, even though nobody believes him anymore. David Camm is trying to rebuild a life that was stolen from him. He lost his wife and his children to a brutal murder, and then he lost 13 years locked in a cage for a crime he didn't commit. Brad and Jill never got to grow up. They never got graduations or first jobs or any of the things kids are supposed to have. They were 7 and 5 years old when Charles Boney took their lives. And David not only had to live with that unbearable loss, but he had to grieve for them from inside a prison cell while the world believed he was the one who killed them. 13 years where he couldn't even properly mourn his own children because he was fighting just to prove he didn't murder them. Because investigators chose the easy answer over the right one. This case should absolutely terrify you. Because David Camm had 11 witnesses confirming his alibi. He had no gunshot residue on his hands. The real killer's DNA and fingerprints were all over the crime scene. And he was still convicted. Twice. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. And that's what makes this case so important to talk about. Not just because an innocent man lost 13 years of his life, but because it shows how dangerous tunnel vision can be in criminal investigations. How junk science can send people to prison. How prosecutors sometimes care more about winning than finding the truth. David Camm's story is a strong reminder that we need to question everything. Every arrest, every conviction, every headline. Because justice isn't always served. Sometimes the system fails. And when it does, innocent people pay the price. If you found this case as disturbing as I did, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories that need to be told. And if you're not already subscribed, subscribe now because I've got more cases like this one coming up. Real stories, no fluff. Drop a comment and let me know what you think about this case. Do you think there's any chance David did do it, or was he truly wrongfully convicted? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.